All right, everybody, welcome to Project Herpetoculture. This is episode 23. I'm your host, Roy Arthur Blodgett, joined as always by the one and only Philip Leitz. And before we jump into the show and introduce our guests, I want to give a shout out to Dylan and the Animals at Home Network for hosting us. And also give a shout out to our sponsors, Charlie, and and also mention our Patreon. We have a few patrons already signed on, and we really appreciate that. As it's been said before, we've got some ambitions beyond just the show itself, and hopefully we can build some momentum and make our way toward realizing those in due time. So, is there anything else we should add, Phil, before I introduce our guest?
I don't think so. I think that about covers it.
Okay. Excellent. Well, our guest today is Nathan Carlos Rupley. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm super glad to have you on the show. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over this last little while here. Enjoyed some conversations we've had over the phone, just kind of BSing about herpetoculture and getting into some of the reasons why we enjoy this thing. So to begin, I'm wondering if you could just give us a kind of an idea of your background, your kind of origin story, upbringing as it relates to herpetoculture.
Yeah, so I was adopted at 6 months old into a family of people that had, I guess I'm the third generation that was raised in West Africa.
Cool.
On my mom's side. So when my grandparents on her side were I guess like they took the last ship out of Argentina to South Africa before World War II. And my mom was 2 years old on that ship. And
Wow.
then they went to South Africa, took a train up and around to Nigeria, and they were missionaries in Nigeria. My grandfather he loved nature. He was a big game hunter when he first went there. And he was the kind of big game hunter that him and his friend would just go out into the bush and shoot a buffalo just to see whose bullet was in it when it fell. By the 80s, he was a huge environmentalist. He had seen Nigeria go from having huge herds of wildlife to almost nothing. And yeah, so I was adopted into that family and moved to Kenya when I was 2. And the wildlife there is doing a lot better than a lot of West Africa. So I was around wildlife a lot as a little kid. And I'm neurodivergent. I'm that place where autism and ADHD meet, and nobody can quite tell like which it is or whatnot. So from a very young age, I memorized everything I could about things I was interested in, and my parents would take me to wildlife parks and stuff like that. So when my grandfather came to visit Kenya, I, at 3 years old, was correcting him on which species of giraffe and zebra and whatnot we were seeing.
That's great.
And then my first experience, so I had a lot of crazy experiences there. My first experience, I was probably 3.5, and my first experience with reptiles. And I was at this preschool, and during recess, we could just kind of wander around the campus of the school. And I found this, it was a tree that had multiple trunks, and a few of the trunks had been cut off low down, and a couple were still growing up high. And there was 2 male and 1 female Jackson's chameleons just hanging out right in the middle of where those trunks all were.
Oh, wow.
And I was just like, what in the world? Like, especially the males with their like crazy horns, I was just like blown away.
Wow.
And so yeah, that was my first like experience, like the first time I remember seeing reptiles. And then so I had a lot of experience with wildlife too. And I can get into some of that later, but then we moved to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
A little different than Kenya.
Different.
And then we moved to Burkina Faso, which it's a landlocked country in West Africa, just kind of in between Niger, Mali, and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast.
Mhm.
And it's one of the poorest countries in Africa, but still has a lot of its traditions that a lot of other countries have had stolen from them by colonialism.
Sure.
So yeah, I was there for 5 years from second grade up until junior high.
Mhm.
Had a lot more experience with animals there. Once again, I can get into some of that later, but then moved back to Lancaster County for junior high. And that was a huge culture shock for me.
I bet.
Wow. Yeah.
And I'm still trying to get used to it here. Like I'm like 45 and I'm still like trying to figure out, like it's not just like American culture is already a huge leap, but Lancaster County culture there's a lot of good stuff here, but it's not very understanding of people that are a little different, and
Sure.
I'm a little different. So yeah, I pretty much hated it here, but then I discovered that there were reptile stores. And I got a paper route so I could buy all the reptiles.
Nice.
Yeah. So yeah, I got a pretty big collection by the time I was maybe halfway through high school. Yeah, very mixed husbandry. My paper route paid enough to buy lots of them, but given that it was the 90s and there wasn't a whole lot of easy information out there, and I was always wanting to buy something new, my husbandry was not great. I like the one thing I think I mentioned this in the comments to Phil before, but I had I'm pretty sure it was an Egyptian. It was a huge Eurymastix.
Yeah.
And I had it in a temporary enclosure, waiting to build something for it. And the enclosure was way too small for it. And it wouldn't move all day. And then at night it would get hyperactive, and it knocked the lid off and pulled the heat lamp down on it, and it killed it. Like,
whoa.
That was kind of a foreshadowing of like I had reptile addiction. And then like late high school, I finally found a place where I fit in. It was with like all the punks and hippies and metalheads and all that. But then I got into like partying and got substance abuse issues and stopped taking care of my animals.
Right.
I gave a lot of them back to the pet shops I had bought them from, but unfortunately it was kind of the timing where I bought them when big snakes were like kind of the thing.
Yeah.
And then they kind of stopped. Not that they weren't still more popular than they probably are today, but like the pet shops didn't really want them back. I had to kind of beg them to take them back from me. And a couple of them died, and my ball python died. And also, the other thing that didn't help was a lot of them were wild caught. And even before I got into drugs, like stuff just started like not thriving and started dying. And yeah, I think a lot of that was them being wild caught. So
Yeah.
then when I like like I said, I got way into drugs and partying and all of that. I moved to the next city over, Lancaster.
Mhm.
Had crazy existence there. Moved to West Philly, had an even crazier existence there. Um, I mean, I got, this isn't the podcast for that, but I've got crazy stories to tell about being out of my mind in West Philly. Because
I don't know.
back then I was a scrawny white boy. Like,
This might be the podcast for that, Nathan.
what's up?
I think Phil said this might actually be the podcast for that.
Yeah, this might be the one, dude. This might be the time.
Let's just say right before I crashed and burned, I found myself in this massive warehouse in West Philly at what was called the End of the World tour. This was like late 1999,
Yeah.
and it was like a crusty punk circus,
Right.
where like there was a rowboat in the middle of it, and they were just like feeding people all kinds of stuff that you probably shouldn't be taking in a situation like that. I kept on going back to the rowboat, and my friend joined the End of the World tour. Fortunately, I didn't.
Wow.
Yeah, West Philly was crazy. I lived in a punk rock crash house in the basement.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And there were 3 punk clubs on the block, and we were the only functional toilet. Like,
Oh my
like
God.
we had one
No.
bathroom, and there would be like 3 shows, like, and like we were the only functional restroom. There, like,
Oh no.
oh yeah. Anyway,
That's
West
awesome.
Philly was crazy. Anyway, so when I eventually like I went off the deep end, and I had gotten way into psychedelics, and then I started blackout drinking to like deal with the anxiety that I was dealing with from being way too into psychedelics and other stuff. And so I crashed and burned and moved back in. My parents happened to be back in the country.
Yeah.
And I moved into a little cabin in the woods with them for a while, and then moved to Nigeria for 6 months with them. They were like, sorry, fruit flies. they were finishing off their term there. So I went back and did a sculpture and welding apprenticeship there, with a guy that worked at the National Museum in Jos, which is kind of the southern part of northern Nigeria.
Wow.
So that was awesome. That was my only time living in Africa as an adult. I had visited before, but that was really cool.
Interesting.
But anyway, so my I guess my whole thing is that I had sworn off of keeping animals. I said I would never keep animals again unless I could absolutely prove to myself that I could take care of myself first.
Right.
So I denied myself keeping animals from 1997 until my kids wanted to get a guinea pig, I guess a pair of guinea pigs, maybe 5 years ago now.
Okay.
Wow.
And so that went pretty well. And then we got a mutant wolf, a dog. And yeah, he's a handful. But yeah. So then I got into inverts. And then finally about a year ago, I got back into reptiles and got a Urodactyloides agricolae.
Nice.
Although people online have mixed feelings about whether it might be a hybrid.
Oh, interesting.
So any plans on breeding are on hold till I can figure out if it is for sure or not.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. So, wow. That's pretty wild. Very cool. What a wild ride.
Yeah, it's been a crazy trip.
Yeah.
Sounds like it. That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah. I wouldn't trade it for
interesting.
anything, but yeah, picked up a lot of trauma along the way.
Sure, I can imagine.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like I think I can relate. I've spoken about how I kind of like as a teenager got way in over my head with reptiles and like was in a bad situation and had to like get rid of my reptiles to get out of that. And like it was, I feel like I can really relate to what you're saying about like that kind of making a promise to yourself to swear off keeping reptiles until you can take care of yourself. I feel like
Yeah.
that's kind of the same promise I made to myself. Like, not, I didn't think of it and not necessarily in that way, but when you said that, it really resonated with me because
Awesome.
yeah, it was like, yeah, I didn't, I didn't want to get back into it until I was confident that I could do it. I knew myself well enough to not get in over my head in that way again. Cause it just felt like it was just so stressful, and
Yeah.
like, I think on some level traumatic to feel like, oh God, like I have all this responsibility. I'm responsible for living things. And like, I need to like move them on to someone else now in like this hasty way. And anyway, it's a complicated thing. And I think it's interesting to, that we share that piece of the journey. And, yeah, I'm curious about like, if you could speak a little bit to just, I mean, you spoke about like what it was like keeping herps in the 90s, but I'm curious if you could just like elaborate more on that, like the 90s versus like now, and how different is that for you? Like how
Yeah.
it was then and how it is now. I have my own experience of that. When I came back in 2018 and I had left the hobby, and it wasn't in the 90s, it was in 2007. But
Yeah.
anyway, I'm curious if you could expand on that a bit.
Well, I have real mixed feelings about the two different time periods.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, I feel like in the 90s, not only was everything wild caught, or I'm not everything, but a
Mm-hmm.
lot more was wild
Yeah.
caught, but also the emphasis was on wildness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the version of wildness was more like the wild man, like
Yeah.
biker or safari helmet wearing guy that like there's still some of them around, but it's a whole different it's a whole different. Oh, one of the things real quick that I forgot to mention, and as I was
Yeah.
going
Yeah.
through in my time period, not in herpetoculture, I got really into rewilding,
Mm-hmm.
and I learned a whole lot about wildness, and it's not what our culture thinks, especially
Mm-hmm.
what it thought back in the 90s. But
Right.
wildness is viewed as like crazy and out of control, and it's like the complete
Chaotic.
opposite. It
Yeah.
like if an animal is crazy and out of control, it gets eaten. Like it
Yeah.
doesn't survive. Like there, it's not that there's not a freedom to wildness, but it's not this like hippie version of like everything's dirty and mangy and doesn't bathe, and animals really take good care of themselves if they can.
Mm-hmm.
So so yeah, I mean it the wild, like I miss like herpetoculture has gotten so obsessed with creating creating snakes that look like stretched out overweight pinkies, like, and just shoving them in what I would keep pencils in,
Yeah.
like. So I miss the wildness, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a weird wildness. I went to the Hamburg reptile show in maybe 94 or 95.
Mm-hmm.
And I went again uh, uh, a few months back, and some things were similar in that it's not very professional and there's lots of venomous stuff, like, with very
I've
little
heard some things about Hamburg.
regulation. But other than that, it was really different because now it's all like morphs of crested geckos, and for better and for worse, a bunch of little stuff. Whereas back, and everything's in little tiny deli cups. Whereas back then, it was like big snakes and like pillowcases, or like like so like a box, and like a box like under their table, and like they're like, oh, what's in there? It's like, oh, it's a Burmese python. Like, oh, that reminds me of a good story. When I went to Hamburg, I was looking around, and I saw a pair of probably wild caught monkey-tailed skinks. And I had just been reading about them in probably Reptiles magazine, something like that. And I was like, oh, I've got to have those. And so I bought them and was carrying them around with me because I didn't have anything to put them in, and the guy that was selling them didn't give me anything to put them in. I just was carrying them around, and they started scratching, like just as they were climbing on me. They started scratching my arms up really bad. And I was like, oh, I'm over this. I don't like these guys are really cool, but I don't really have any setup for them. I don't know what I'm doing with them, and they're scratching me up really bad. And I went with my mom, and I was talking to her about it. And there was this like dude sitting behind his table with like nothing interesting really. And he was like, hey, I'll trade you for those. And this is to like anybody but me at that time, this is probably the worst trade that has ever happened in the existence of herpetoculture. Oh, no. But I'm like, what do you have? And he's like, he pushes this tote out from underneath his table, and he's like, I got this Burmese python. And I'm like, yeah, can I see it? And he's like, oh, it's kind of mean. Like the guy I got it from, I think, stabbed it in the back.
What?
So this is the 90s, herpetoculture in the 90s.
Wow.
Yeah. So I looked at it, and I like looking back, I think it might have actually been an Indian python, which was at the time still part of the same species. I'm not sure. It looked real different than the other Burms I saw. Anyway, it was 9-foot female with a big scar on its back, and its back had been broken and bent. And but that was that was all healed. It was healthy, but you know, not surprisingly, it was a pretty defensive snake. But to me, it's funny. Like I used to be scrawny, and but my thing was big snakes. And I didn't care that it was defensive. It like I knew how to handle it. I knew how to deal with it. You know, it worked perfectly for me. It was like a great trade for me, but anybody else, like like a super defensive injured like Burmese python for two monkey-tailed skinks. Like,
that's a rough trade, man.
Bad trade. But yeah, I mean that was the thing back then. Like, so much was about big stuff. I mean, it's still too popular, but back then it was like so much about showing off, like how, like, who had the biggest monitor, who had the biggest python or whatnot. I mean, there was a bunch of small stuff too that was sold, but I mean, the emphasis was really on anything bigger than a boa. And kind of added points if it was like defensive enough that it would like hiss and like scare people, but hopefully not bite them.
That totally checks out of my recollection of that time.
That was also
the pet shop. Like the pet shop that was my favorite back then. It was crazy. Like the owner of it could have been on like Tiger King. his personal collection had bears and wolves, and
Whoa.
like in the back of the pet shop, it was like half reptiles, half fish. And then you'd go to the back and there was a big room with a big window in it, and there was a mountain lion that lived back there.
Holy shit.
That he would take it home at night, but like,
wow.
like
crap, dude.
And then a smaller room with a like full grown iguana in it.
Jeez.
And man, they had everything.
Wow.
Those are the days, man. Those were the days.
Yeah. If you wanted your animals to like die like shortly after you bought them. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the selection of stuff,
yeah.
like I'd have to go online to find a lot of that stuff these days.
Yeah.
Like there's a reptile shop not too far from me that's within like a huge fish store.
Okay.
But like there used to be 3 like pretty much just reptile shops in the area, and now it's all like the chains and then one like massive independent store.
Why is that? You know, any idea?
I don't know.
Interesting. Because I feel like more here in Colorado now than there were in the 90s. There was one in the 90s.
Oh,
it was basically Reptilian Haven. And the first time I worked there for a little while, from the age of 16 until, I don't know, maybe 21 or something like that, 20, 21, kind of on and off. And the first time I ever went in there, there were Burmese, albino Burmese, and retics, and big, you know, boas, and alligator snappers, and caiman, and you know, the owner had a venomoid albino diamondback rattlesnake, and just all this stuff, which you can't even have here anymore. You know, it was a pretty wild spot. But after that, there grew a couple other reptile specific stores here in Colorado, and now there's, I don't know, 3 or 4, and there's 3 or 4 chains, like 3 or 4 with more than one location.
Okay.
know? So it's got a lot bigger here.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's grown a lot, which is pretty fascinating. But yeah, anyway, I can remember, you know, it's just interesting when I hear about places that have maybe less than there were in the 90s, because now it feels like here there's just infinitely more, oddly enough.
I feel like here it's less too. Like all the small like mom and pops kind of pet shops are all gone pretty much in this area that I can think of. And you have like the chains, but then the one constant through all of it has been East Bay Vivarium, which is about an hour from me, which is of course legendary, big, huge shop. But I remember going in there as a kid and it was the same thing. You know, they had these huge Burmese pythons, albino Burmese pythons. They had a huge water monitor.
Yeah.
And sometimes they would just have stuff just like cruising around the shop, you know.
Oh yeah.
Like
big
old monitors that could like maim a child just walking around.
Yeah, man.
They don't do that anymore.
Used to have, so at Reptilian Haven there were a couple of guys who worked there, one who had a big red green iguana, and then another guy with a big rhino iguana who they would let kind of cruise and stuff. And I remember thinking, like, seems a little risky, but you know, whatever. It's not really going to do much. But then there was a local reptile shop, and I've talked about this before, but years ago there was a local reptile shop here in Colorado that is no longer in business, thank Christ, because they were doing some pretty shitty stuff. But one of the things they did was they were letting a massive black-throat monitor roam the store, like massive black-throat, like, you know, head this big, you know, just like a honk to a massive animal. And I just remember thinking, I'm like, it's only a matter of time till that thing just snipes a kid or you know, or some person's leg who's not paying attention, just because, or, you know, not because the monitor is an asshole, but because the damn black-throat monitor let run free in a shop. That's why, totally. not because there's anything wrong with a black-throat.
It's not the lizard's fault. Yeah,
it's not the lizard's fault. You know what I mean?
Other reptile shop that I went to was really small, but like all he had was large snakes and large monitors.
Okay.
Like,
oh my gosh.
They were just like crammed in there. And I was
Yeah.
like, there was this like big white throat monitor, I'm pretty sure it was. And I was like so ready to buy that thing.
Yeah.
And like I was like, can I hold it? And he's like,
no.
oh yeah, yeah. So the thing was like perfectly tame,
Yeah.
but you know, like I've mentioned before, I was scrawny, and this thing was massive. Like I had a
Yeah.
big Savannah, and it was crazy, but I could manage it. But this thing, like I was holding it, and it like, you know, its body was from there to like there,
Yeah.
and it was like awesome. But I shifted my weight, and it thought it was falling, and so it tried to climb me.
Oh,
And I had huge gashes just all over my arm,
Yeah.
and I was like, yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
I-
serious.
Yeah, anyway, I had something I was gonna go back to, but actually I think it's better if we keep rolling, Roy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise I think I'm gonna get too deep too fast.
Okay. Well, I'm curious about like something that you've spoken to me a bit about in the past is just kind of like this concept of like a holistic collection. And I'm curious if you could like speak a bit to that, what that means to you and how you're like moving toward that.
Yeah. So one of the things, not only did I get into rewilding, but I got into permaculture and a bunch of you know, systems thinking, regenerative agriculture type stuff in my time off. And so I've been like incorporating those concepts into it, as well as just kind of bringing my personal philosophy and stuff I pick up from watching Animals at Home and you guys and all of that stuff. So yeah, I think it's really important to not just focus in on like this animal, this enclosure, but your whole collection. And that thinking about stuff at the collection level. And so that includes having a good collection should be as much. Well, I'm an artist, and when you're learning to draw, like at school, they teach you about negative space.
Yeah.
And I think your collection should be judged as much by what you don't have than by what you have.
Oh, interesting.
Like I think it's more important to whittle down what you're going to have in your collection before you get it, and then have to get rid of it if it's too much. Like for me, you know, I've only got 3 reptiles, and I plan on keeping it that way for a good while. I mean, I've got the Urodactylodes and the 2 grass-tailed lizards. And I'd love to have a snake, but I can't right now because I'm renting, and that's fine with me. I'm like, you know, there's times when it's not really fine with me, but like overall, it's been a blessing. And so yeah, keeping a small collection, I think for most people is important. Now it's different for somebody like Phil, who's like it's their career.
Yeah.
But you could also even make it a career, like if you incorporated it holistically into everything else you do. And so that's one thing that I try and do is like, you know, I'm an artist. I do rewilding stuff. I make music. I like am into animals. I'm into plants and all of that stuff. And I don't want any one of those things to be my whole career.
Sure.
And I think if you can try and make it, in permaculture, they talk about stacking functions.
Yeah.
And so it's killing 2 birds with 1 stone. When you try and do something that where you're taking one action and you're getting multiple benefits from that action. And so that, I mean, that's the other thing is, if you can design your collection to have, first of all, animals that meet multiple of your needs, at the same time. So, say you want to get into breeding, instead of jumping in and breeding something really expensive that's really hard to breed and may or may not sell, maybe you have no experience trying to sell animals, maybe breed something that you don't mind or might even be designed to be fed to something else. Like binos geckos or mourning geckos, or one of those parthenogenic species that could be fed to snakes that would maybe be better off eating lizards, at least as young snakes, definitely, than eating mice. And it doesn't mean you can't have those as pets. I mean, when I was in high school, I had rats and mice that were pets, but they also bred as feeders. So trying to figure out how you can get multiple yields out of your animals.
Right.
But one thing is trying to know yourself, trying to really figure out what am I looking for here. So one of my favorite species is parenti monitors.
Right.
But
understandable.
I mean, they're amazing. But I'm never gonna have one. So then I try and find something that is meets some of those needs. So like Kimberly rock monitors have almost as cool of a pattern. They have that like long neck, long tail. They hunt in the same way, only a much smaller package. They've got that intelligent look to them, but they're still really expensive. And even though they're relatively small, I couldn't keep one in anything except a huge enclosure. So then you try and find something that meets as much of those needs as possible in a smaller package. And so for me, like I found the grass tail lizards, like the long-tailed grass lizards, and they're tiny other than their tail. They don't have as long a neck. They're obviously not as cool, but they hunt the same way. They're really smart. They look like tiny little monitor lizards when they go after those crickets. Like, oh, it's so cool to watch. But then even from them, like if what you're really looking for is something that hunts in that same way and has that same intelligent look in its eye, maybe just get a jumping spider. Like, they're like jumping spiders. I mean, they have a smarter look in their eye and are more interactive, and they're just like, whereas my like long-tailed lizards are like vicious, taking down a cricket the size of their head. The jumping spider is vicious, taking down a cricket twice its size. Oh, I had a female jumping spider, and it had tons of babies, and those were fun to watch eat fruit flies. But then it got older. They don't live very long, unfortunately. And I felt bad for the crickets because it went from taking down like big crickets to just stealing their legs. Like, it was like, I'm not taking this whole thing down. It was just like,
I'll just take a drumstick today.
And run away. So taking like if you have this like huge grandiose vision, maybe that's something down the road that you might be able to get, but try and shrink it down and try and get your same needs met from something as small and reasonable as possible. Another thing is trying to incorporate other things from your life that are productive. So in the long run, if we ever have our own house, I would love to have a sunroom or a greenhouse attached to it, where I can keep reptiles, but it also has fish ponds and a miniature food forest, and I can, you know, be breeding fish either for food or to sell or just for fun. Like propagating plants in the ponds and in the land part of the greenhouse. It can be, you know, providing heat for our house, and the house can be buffering the heat in the greenhouse. So stuff like that, where you can incorporate, you know, aesthetic appeal, a place to relax, experience nature, much larger enclosures than you would have even if you're building a big enclosure inside. If you've got a greenhouse, you know, you can go even bigger because you're spending the money on building that in order to do a whole bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
Then when it comes to both your collection and your enclosures, I really recommend looking into permaculture principles and design techniques. I've kind of gotten disenchanted with a lot of permaculture. There's a lot of charlatans in it, and a lot of like economic privilege, where, you know, it's kind of, you know, I worked in finance and now I'm stepping down and simplifying my life, but it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to buy land if you start poor than if you start rich and step like.
Bill and I were just talking about this.
You know, I've gotten kind of, you know, and plus a lot of the principles are just straight ripped off of indigenous people.
Yeah.
All that being said, I still recommend going in and looking at like some of the design principles, and one of the design techniques is what is it? Needs yields or something like that. It's where you look at, you take all the different elements of your design and you figure out what does this thing need and what does it give off, and then you try and connect those all up. So like you put yourself at the center, and you think about your family, you think about your neighbors, you think about your animals, your plants, like all the different elements of it. And so you can do it at an enclosure scale where you're like, you know, what are the flows of air going to be? What's the light going to be? Where's the water coming from? Where does the water go? Where does the waste go? And you're trying to build all these connections for cycles, so that everything, you know, that's coming in, if at all possible, you're like producing on site, and everything that goes out you're using on site. Obviously you're never going to get it perfectly unless you're just living in nature as nature, but trying to use those, and then I guess, yeah, there's so much I could talk about, but I kind of, maybe a final one would just be getting into enclosures that are more like paludariums or something like that, where you can keep multiple species and build a whole ecosystem, you know, with you know, maybe a arboreal tarantula, or a small lizard or small snake that lives up top, and then underneath the water you can have shrimp and fish. And you know, I have aquariums that you know, I've got little ecosystems, and I'd put food in for my shrimp, but I probably wouldn't need to. They've got so many little creatures, and so much like growth going on. I do water changes, but not very frequently. It's mostly taken care of by the plants. So yeah, trying to set up these little tiny ecosystems And you can really push it far. I'm still experimenting in all of this, and probably will never stop. But there's a guy, I forget his name, but he runs Houston Frogs, and he breeds dart frogs, but he also has a company that raises mushrooms. And he has beneficial fungi cultures that you can spread in your tanks. The one product I saw that seems to have disappeared from his website, I was really hoping to buy, but it's a slime mold that it crawls around. It might climb on the glass a little bit, but for the most part, it climbs around in the soil looking for different germs and diseases and whatnot, and it feeds on them.
Cool.
Oh wow.
So yeah, I really hope he restocks that, or I can find it somewhere else. It's just this like flat yellow clear glob that just like slowly oozes around. I really hope to be able to find that, because not only is it serving an actual function, but it just looks so cool too.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, just trying to be as holistic as you can.
I really like that, just like outlook on it. I like what you were speaking to around just kind of like fitting herpetoculture into like your broader like lifestyle. Like I think like what comes to mind for me is like images I've seen, on like different like social media accounts, but also in books and stuff like that. Often of like, not to like go back to this trope, but like often in Europe of like, people having like, an awesome greenhouse where they're keeping herbs too, and like, or like, there's someone I follow actually who, I'd like to actually have on the show, so I'm not going to reveal who it is right now, but, they have an indoor greenhouse that's just like this incredible thing. And it's just like in their living room, and it's like full of live plants, and they have a bunch of amazing reptiles in there as well, and invertebrates and all this stuff. And like I don't know, I like that, like that kind of merging of like leisure space, and the reptiles are there as well, like sitting on the couch and like watching the animals as they go about their thing. As much as I love like having like my dedicated like reptile room, and it's like all about maximizing efficiency for that space, I think that that's one thing I want to be doing when I'm about to be building a couple new little reptile buildings, and I want to actually have more of that kind of more space for like just being in there and interacting in the space in other ways and observing them. But then I also just like really appreciate this kind of weaving in of like the permaculture principles. I feel like that's something that you and I have spoken to about. I have a little bit of experience with permaculture as well, and have long felt like that's like just a perfect, like so much of that, the elements and design principles are like perfectly applicable to herpetoculture. And like even just like planned redundancy, like this principle of redundancy is one of them. And I think about like this quote that we often reference from our episode with Armin of Herp Time, and he's talking about just like it's easier to take care of one type of species, or like one thing, and apply the same care to 100 animals than it is to apply different care to like 6 different things. Even that is like within that principle to some degree. But I agree. I just think that
I agree with that, but I can't personally do that. And I solve that by being super holistic and trying to keep it small. Like in the long run, if like I can afford it, and if I have the space, I would love to have some birds and mammals and all the like stuff, mushroom production and like stuff from every kingdom, and but keep it just like spend my time really refining what's like the 1 or 2 birds that are just the best for me, and that can, like provide eggs for a monitor lizard, or
Yeah,
or
totally.
the chicks can be eaten by a ball python, or whatever it is, to really, because I agree with him, and I understand exactly what he's saying, but with my personality type, I can't just focus in on one thing, and
Yeah.
yeah, I guess that goes back to trying to keep your collection small. The one thing I really have been thinking about a lot lately, and have kind of set for myself, is that research while you're obsessed, and buy when you're not. Like,
Yeah.
because
I
I
like
take
that.
these deep dives, and it's my autism and ADHD conflicting with each other. So like, maybe my deep dive, like I took a deep dive into edible wild plants for 10 years. And that, like, I was just obsessed with it. I had other related stuff, but for the most part, my deep dives, it's like, I'm like, oh, I like reptiles, I like lizards, I'm interested in lizards. Oh, I just remembered tarantulas. Like,
Yeah.
iNaturalist, like this species, like, and like Google Scholar, like every YouTube video, and so I'm like just out of nowhere, I'm like taking this deep dive into fish, like, or like arachnids or whatever, and I can't control, like I have some influence over it, but I can't control these obsessions that I get. When I'm in those modes, I want everything. Like, I need that, I need it now. But then I've gone through that cycle so many times that I realized, yeah, so if I really like this animal or this plant or whatever it is, I'm still going to be interested in it even when I'm not obsessed with it. And I'll use my obsession to research, and maybe even start setting up an enclosure for it, or at least designing it in my head. One other thing, back to the holistic keeping, another principle is maybe start with if, say, you've got this species in mind, don't buy that species. Start like with all the feeders that it's going to need, and learn how to culture them, and learn how to culture the plants that would be in it, and work your way up to that target species. Yeah.
Interesting.
I like that. I remember when I first started getting back into so I was when I got back to herpetoculture, I started with snakes. And when I started getting back into lizards, I remember part of the excitement about getting back into lizards for me was also raising the feeders.
Yeah.
like getting into that whole thing. And so I can relate to that little piece there.
Yeah.
So
So I love my feeders as much as my pets. And no, I'm not talking about in terms of loving them, I am, but I try and have a really high standard of care for my feeders. I'm not talking about the crickets I buy at the store, stuff like that. But any like feeders that I'm gonna raise, I try and raise them as naturalistic as possible. So my roaches are in planted aquarium, terrariums, but yeah. And yeah, and you learn stuff from that. I learned that I can't keep spiderwort with my green banana roaches because they devour it.
Interesting.
And then the other thing is leaf litter is so amazing for roaches. Like
they love it. Yeah.
like it one thing, it buffers, like if I'm like not feeding them as often as I should be, then it's a buffer where they can eat the leaf litter. But then like I've found that my roaches, either if I don't have leaf litter in with them, they either bury themselves all the time, or they climb up to the top and try and get out. But as soon as I put leaf litter in there, they're it's counterintuitive, but they're way more visible.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've got little Kenyan roaches and green banana roaches, and both of them are so much fun to watch. They unfortunately they don't quite fit what I need for feeders right now. The green banana roaches as adults are just slightly too big for my lizards, and as young they're not very interesting to the lizards, and they'll mostly bury themselves. And the little Kenyans are just like that their whole life. So
yeah.
But I mean, I've got them as pets, and I do occasionally feed the green banana roaches to my tarantulas. So
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
yeah.
I was pretty intrigued by what you said, by the research when you're obsessed, by when you're not. I really like that quite a bit, and it resembles some maybe not identically, but something that I've been doing in recent years, because I think the further you dive into herpetoculture or the keeping of anything in captivity, you start to gain an obsession. When you find something new and interesting, you want to learn more about it. And so you kind of dive into finding out more about that animal. And sometimes you might get the feeling like, oh, this might be a great addition here. Maybe it's time to add that here. And you start kind of gaining that momentum, and the energy starts to build, and you start to get more excited and everything. And I've definitely started doing this thing where if I find something that really intrigues me, I research the shit out of it while I'm extra psyched. And then I just wait. I just pause, just let it sink in, see what happens. Because then sometimes, a little bit of time can go by and you can think, oh, I was just really interested in that. It's not something I'd really want to put a lot of time into keeping. But then every once in a while, that just continues to build. The interest just continues to build, and the intrigue just continues to build. And it sounds more fun, and it sounds more interesting. And it's like, okay, if this is something that's really, taking over my consciousness in this way, then perhaps it is a good fit here. And so then maybe you can start looking into buying, or saying, all right, maybe it's time to add this, or maybe it's time to really start looking and getting serious about what it means to actually purchase this animal and take on that responsibility. It also reminds me a little bit of that saying that it's better to go to the grocery store when you're not hungry.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes. You're gonna buy better food for yourself. If I go to the grocery store when I'm hungry, I'm gonna buy some garbage, man, and I'm gonna buy some stuff I don't need. But if I go when I'm full, I'm gonna be like, no, grilled meat and vegetables, and that's all I'm gonna eat. Leave me alone. You know what I mean? So I think that's a pretty cool. I like that as a principle, as a guiding ethos. In terms of what you want to, when you're making decisions about what to buy and what not to buy. I also want to say that I'm also very much intrigued by the idea of, if there's something that you're interested in, perhaps start by caring for the things that it eats, and sort of working from the bottom up. And mainly the thing that interests me about that is that's a pretty unique perspective that I can't say I've ever heard anybody else voice. And I may have some concern. Obviously there's some level of there's a plasticity that it doesn't have in terms of practicality, because there's certainly, you can't do that with everything, right? I mean, you can do that with stuff that, with regard to what feeders we have access to, right? And but I think that's cool, because I think that there's probably a lot of things that are very educational when you're working from sort of the ground up there, and there's if you're more familiar with the prey items of that animal, or the food source of that animal, or and you're more familiar with how to take care of all those things, then conceivably I could imagine having a slightly more intimate relationship with whatever animal it is that you end up picking up once you've gone up that ladder. That's a pretty intriguing perspective that I've never heard before. I like that a lot.
I think it probably comes from me keeping a lot more inverts than I do reptiles.
Yeah.
I think it really really helps build that, and also like not just the land inverts, but the shrimp have really influenced me a lot.
Yeah.
Just thinking about starting with the little tiny things. One thing I wanted to talk about that's related to that is I'm really into aquarium stuff. I don't actually have any fish, but I've got a bunch of tanks and bowls and whatnot. And one of the guys that I got really into is called Father Fish.
That's a great name.
He's like a kind of like a hippie guru. If instead of trying to sell you like snake oil stuff or some weird philosophy, he was trying to get you to have like naturalistic fish tanks. Like
That's awesome.
He was a missionary before, and
wow.
now he's a missionary for like natural tanks, and he's taken the Wallstad method. And it was this lady that made these like really holistic fish tanks, but they would like kind of burn out after 2 years, and he's found like 2 major flaws with them and like patched those up with like more holistic, mimicking nature. And his stuff is so awesome. And he's got these things called I think they're called resurrection jars, where you just take like a container, a glass or plastic container, and go out to a pond or a creek or something and just grab a handful of mud and moss or whatever, and put it in there and just put it on your windowsill and just watch what grows. And I haven't actually done exactly that, but I've done basically that only with the aquariums and bowls that I have, and with the grow lights instead of the sunlight. And you get so many cool little things growing in there. It's a whole little ecosystem. And the shrimp just love that. The only thing the shrimp didn't like was there were dragonfly nymphs that ruined my one. And I think they killed one of my shrimp, and then I moved the shrimp into another container. And but for the most part, it's just all this little tiny organisms just floating around. And so you're basically building a backup food source. Just a whole little ecosystem of tiny little food sources.
So, I mean, you mentioned invert keeping. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about just like what the kind of like overlaps and deviations are for you between herp keeping and keeping inverts.
Well, one thing that's nice about the invert world is there's way less morphs. People are way more into wild type animals. It's creeping in, but that's not really a big thing. There's a lot of overlap in terms of people justifying really small enclosures. The nice thing is that it what's really small to an invert, it's still pretty big compared to like say in the tarantula world, a lot of people keep their tarantulas in something like that. And but that's still 3 times the size of the tarantula. It's not like a ball python in a freedom breeder like that can't even stretch out at all. but I do find that the inverts, I think they get better care than reptiles do, in some ways at least. I mean, some of them have less personality or less obvious personality than the reptiles do, but some of them have really big personalities. One thing that I really think about a lot, I'm not sure if other people do, is how different their sensory abilities are from ours. So I've got a West African giant tailless whip scorpion, and it's I kind of regret getting it. One thing is it hides all the time. It only comes out at 3 o'clock at night, and if I turn the light on, it's like mad and runs away. So it's the coolest animal in the whole world. It's amazing, but it's a horrible pet. The only people that enjoy them as pets don't keep them properly and don't give them a good hide. And so they're crazy for an invertebrate. They of the invertebrates that they've studied, it has the biggest part of its brain that deals with sensory processing.
Interesting.
I forget what that part is called, but and I think part of the reason why is because they've got these legs that have basically evolved into antennas. So they're these huge, long, crazy things, and they've got little tiny hairs all over them that detect air pressure and chemical like smells and vibrations. And for me, I kind of don't know whether they should be in people's houses as pets, because as somebody with sensory issues, I know what it's like to have sensory overload and not be able to get away from it. And I don't know enough about their sensory abilities to know whether I'm providing a proper environment for it. I mean, I have it set up in a bioactive setup, and like I keep it way more humid than most people do, and like I let it hide. The pothos grows its hide shut sometimes. I have to like take the roots off and every 6 months take a look at it, but I try and provide it the best that I can. But to me, it's a lot of pressure to think about, like, what is this thing sensing right now, and like what's going on in our house that might be like causing it problems. And it's the same thing for all the animals, but it's extra pressure. Tarantulas, I didn't know until recently that their hairs not only sense little vibrations and stuff, but they can smell with their feet, like the hairs on their feet. Like I had no idea.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean there's not that you shouldn't think about that stuff with reptiles, but to me it's actually a little more pressure even than to think about, like, wow, like what is this creature's experience of the world, and can I provide it something that's not like, can I provide it an enclosure that's like really appropriate for it.
I think there's a lot of important stuff to chew on there, because I have various feelings about this. There's a lot of kind of ways I can think about this particular topic, but one of the things is I do think a lot about my individual animal's experience You know, I
Mhm.
think that this relates back to the conversation we had with Philippe de Vogely, which was where Philippe was sort of talking about how keeping an animal in your care teaches you about another form of consciousness. It's a way of
Yeah.
growing your empathy. It's another kind of consciousness that you have to sort of expand your senses and your understanding to better care for, to better understand, to better relate to. And it makes me think all the time about the experience my animals have here at the shop, especially, I mean, I don't necessarily, I don't think too much about the dubia and my dubia colony. Perhaps I should reconsider that, for various reasons. But, for example, Pork Chop, my big male Egyptian Euromastix, I think about him all the time. Him and Boulder, the female, I think about their experience all the time. How bored are they? How happy are they? How comfortable are they? How hungry are they? How tired are they? Everything. I think about it all the time, and about the way they're experiencing certain things here at the shop. So, I think that that's a perspective that is lacking in some ways in herpetoculture, or at least it can be. And I think it's pretty admirable, because I can't say I would personally, I can't say I have ever extended that same courtesy to like something like a whip scorpion or a vinegaroon or something like that, which, I'm not saying I shouldn't. I just hadn't,
Well,
just,
you probably haven't taken a deep dive
yeah, that's
into
right.
them. Like I
Yeah.
never, when I bought it, I had done a ton of research on it.
Yeah.
I hadn't taken like a huge deep dive into it. Like I hadn't really gone into like the scientific literature and all of that. Like I had researched it as a pet. And I think it's really unfortunate that so many of the popular YouTube channels hype up a lot of animals. And it's the same thing for the vinegaroon that I have, which is a somewhat similar animal. It like the YouTube videos I watched on them, I learned a ton about them, but none of it really was from their perspective. All of it was just like, oh, this is a cool animal that you can have and you can handle it. And it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a ton of cool animals. Every animal's cool. Like, and so, something can be like the coolest animal on the planet, but if it's not a good pet, maybe we shouldn't be like keeping them, or else maybe only people that are really really into a certain aspect. Like there's a guy that runs Roach Crossing, and he keeps a species of tailless whip scorpion that's smaller and is communal. And I don't think his thing is like, if you watch a lot of the YouTube videos on the whip scorpions, it's all about like, oh, this is a great thing to handle, but they're not. They're not great to handle. Like if you're keeping it without a hide, or you have it in a box without a hide, and you encourage it to crawl onto your hand, and you're over a table, sure, it's great to handle. But if you're trying to take that thing from its hide, it's either going to attack you or it's going to drop on the floor and run away. Like, speaking from personal experience, we lived in a log cabin with like all kinds of cracks everywhere. And I took it out to check on it. And every time I had taken it out to check on it, it was like pressing itself up against the hide, like glued there. And like, in the YouTube videos, they tap it and it like crawls onto their hand. And so I would tap it and it wouldn't do anything. So one time I took it out, and I forget, maybe I was watering the enclosure, but I took the hide like this, was looking at it, and I heard thump. And I look over, and it's not on the hide, and it's on the ground. And I go to grab it, and it like puts its little claws, its pedipalps up at me, and I flinched for a split second. And as I froze, it like dove in a crack behind the chimney.
Oh my gosh.
And it was like pressed in the crack like this with just a little bit out. I took a little tiny paintbrush and tried to coax it out, but it kept on just turning and going farther back in, and it was gone.
Wow.
And so, yeah, I just lost my pet. And so what I did was, they like humidity a lot more than a lot of people realize. So I took a clear plastic box and put a bunch of damp sphagnum moss in there and just put it up right next to that. And I would leave it overnight for like the next 2 weeks. And it was never there in the morning. And so I just gave up. And then one morning, about 6 weeks later, I walk into the kitchen, and I kind of look over at the dog's water bowl, and the thing was like laying with its face like leaning on the edge of the dog's water bowl, asleep. Wow. And I managed to catch it.
Wow.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, it's like my experience with it is so different than like so many of the like YouTube videos I watched made it seem like. Even the book that I have by Orrin McMonigal, I think his name is. It's a really, really good book, but it doesn't cover some of how difficult they are to interact with. That kind of brings me to an idea that I wish there were like community centers for animal keeping. Like herpetoculture is so individualistic. We each have our own little collections or big collections, and I just wish there was a place in each town where you could go like volunteer to help out taking care of the animals, and you could get experience with them and find out like, is this something I want to really keep? Because so many animals that I've gotten like seemed like the most awesome thing ever, and they're amazing animals, but when you get them home, they don't really behave the way like they're portrayed sometimes.
Totally.
And
yeah,
it would be so nice to be able to like, because I mean you can like do all the research in the world, and if you don't have experience with it, you don't know what it's really going to be like. And then just for the future, I don't think we're going to live in a world where people are going to be able to have a whole lot of animals that require tons of electricity to heat them and light them and all of that. And I mean, it would be really nice if we were like working on building community now. But yeah.
Yeah, I often wish that there were more outlets like that, just for like kind of education and experience. I mean, I think that we just had another guest that we recorded with recently. We were talking about this same thing, and a need for more of that, like more experiential, hands-on kind of learning opportunities and apprenticeships and stuff like that within herpetoculture. Feels like there's a huge niche there that could be filled.
Yeah.
But yeah. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is we've talked a little bit about like coming from kind of nature connection community to some degree, like tracking, and I'm curious about how that has woven in with your practice of herpetoculture?
Yeah. So one of the things is that in tracking practice, you do animal mimicry,
Mm-hmm.
where you move like the animal and try and get inside the animal's head.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's partly influenced just exactly what I was talking about with the
Yeah,
invert.
just what you were just talking about. Yeah.
But also with the with my really skittish long-tailed grass lizards, trying to figure out they're so complicated, trying to get like into their brain. And then well, one thing I should say is that I'm not your typical tracker,
Mm-hmm.
in that I'm horrible at identifying footprints, and I'm not great with mammals.
Mm-hmm.
I can I can kind of guess some things based on mammal tracks, and
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of figure out based on the environment, like I should try and go near water, or I should
Mm-hmm.
be near a thicket for this thing or that thing. But like my big focus in tracking is on invertebrates,
Interesting.
and also plants. The two of those combined, I think, set a really good groundwork that actually can then translate to mammals and birds and stuff that more people track.
Mm-hmm.
But the plant and invert relationship is so amazing.
Mm.
There, there's a series of tracking books. Mark Elbrock did the
Mm-hmm.
mammal book, and recently came out with a second edition, which is huge and really
Yeah, it's an
good.
awesome book. Yeah.
And that whole series is, they've got mammals, they've got birds, they've got reptiles and amphibians, and they've got insects and other invertebrates.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the books are absolutely amazing. The reptiles would be better if I wasn't in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, totally.
Like it's like if I was in like Arizona or California or something like that, it would probably come in a lot more handy for me.
Mm-hmm.
But the invertebrate tracking book is just mind blowing. Um, uh, I've got a massive library of nature books of all kinds, and if I had to say there was one that has just completely blown my mind and shifted my understanding of nature, so much of tracking the invertebrates is looking at like feeding sign on plant leaves or
Mm-hmm. Right.
mushrooms. Um, uh, it's so, there's so many invertebrates, will eat like just one like genus of plants.
Right.
And it's so crazy that that you can, well, there's so much to know. That's true of all nature study, but this
Yeah.
really blew my mind. And the guy, I can't remember his name right now. We're Facebook friends, but I can't remember his name right now.
Mm.
He actually has a digital book on just leaf miners.
Oh, wow.
So and I believe he covers every single known species of North American leaf miner. It's massive. I think it's like 900 pages or something like
Oh
that.
my God.
It's only online because he just did a Patreon thing where you could access it online. Sorry, my dog's barking in the background.
It's okay.
Okay.
Anyway, so leaf miners are when an invertebrate will live inside. So on a leaf, you've got like the outside, basically like skin, and then you inside you've got softer material, and these creatures eat that softer inside material, and some of them, they eat out different patterns in it. and you can tell by like the species of plant and the pattern, like what like what invertebrate is eating it. So there's like blotch mines, which are a blotch. There's the ones I like the best are linear leaf mines, where you can see where it laid the egg. There's this tiny little circle, and then there's this winding path that comes out away from it. And as the like little invert grows, the path gets slightly wider and slightly wider until eventually it gets to a certain stage in its life, and then it eats its way out and like flies away or crawls away or whatever. And so you can tell, like based on the pattern and the plant, like what that is. And it just, there's so many. I mean, that's just like one example of like how crazy it goes. And so that reinforced my like interest in studying nature based on connections, instead of this species, this species, this species, and this kingdom, this kingdom, this kingdom. Like yeah, there's so much you can learn about each species or whatever, but the really important stuff is like all the connections that exist between the different species. And you know, any of the field guides that cover that are what I just eat up. Yeah, it's so fascinating just trying to figure out like what does this thing that seems unrelated tell me about like that thing. And it with my like interest in taking deep dives into different stuff, it's like you start with like one like creature, and you end up, it's like 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon or whatnot. It's like someplace in just a few connections you end up like studying like feeding patterns of slugs on mushrooms, or you know, just like, you end up like taking all these different like winding tours, like
it makes me think of like the importance of like native plants, you know, in like gardens and stuff like that. Like that's something that I do like lots of like teaching around like just basic eco literacy and stuff like that around this area. And one thing we talk a lot about is like how like the oak savannas and oak woodlands in this region support the greatest biodiversity of species, and even just like just Lepidoptera, like just like moths and butterflies, you know, like this one oak species hosts, you know, 88 species of Lepidoptera as its larval food host.
Damn.
You know, and then you can, and then like, but then when you extrapolate that out, it's like, and then that's the base, like all those caterpillars are like the base of the food web for all of the songbirds, you know, and like you very quickly are just like, whoa, like this one species, you know, is supporting so much life around here. And
I mean, oaks
like you said, it's all about those connections.
Yeah, I've got a book called Macro Fungi Associated with Oaks.
Oh yeah,
it's a whole field guide to mushrooms that grow in connection to oaks. And like, you know, native plants are important, but like I mean, oaks just around the world are such amazing trees that provide so much. I was really into the idea of eating acorns for a long time. It's a lot of work, but
it's a lot of work. Yep, I've done it. I know how it goes.
But
it is amazing though to think about. Like there's certain things that I think about sometimes, like how like the northern hemisphere is like, it's like circumscribed with oaks, you know, and it's also like circumscribed with brown bears. And I think that for like I mean, this is getting kind of like a bit out there, but like for someone who comes from like people who are very far removed from their like indigenous origins, like my ancestral lands, it's interesting for me to consider like, well, what are the parallels between the land that I live on now and that ancestral land? And
Yeah.
like oaks and brown bears are on that list of like I know that my ancestors interacted with those species,
Yeah.
or those like families of animals and plants because they were there.
Mhm.
And I don't know, I think that kind of stuff is interesting to think about. But
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm mixed ethnicity. My ancestry is English, Spanish, and Native Mexican from the Nuevo Leon region,
Mm-hmm.
and all of them ate acorns at some point in their history, and it's crazy how many different plant genuses, not the same species, but genuses I've found that were eaten all three of those places. But the one thing I discovered this book, I've only looked at it online, but it's available for free, and it's the Herpetofauna of Nuevo Leon. And I've also gone on iNaturalist and looked at the inverts, and it's crazy how many of the species that are in that region are species that I'm like obsessed with and had already learned about through something else. Also the people like before colonization that I come from in Mexico they traveled across the border before there was a border seasonally, from Nuevo Leon up to San Antonio area. And I find myself, I'm obsessed with herps from all over the world, but I find myself being really interested in animals that live on both sides of the border. And I don't know if that has something to do with that. But I find it, a lot of the tarantulas and snakes that I'm into, especially, seem to like be like in Mexico, but like a little bit in the U.S. or in the U.S. and a little bit into Mexico. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah,
Great.
It's just a really rich region in terms of herpetofauna and invertebrate.
Oh, there it is. There we go.
I just made up that word.
Did you?
But I don't know. I think so.
Sounded legit to me.
I got you fooled.
Yeah.
Well, we're cruising up on 2 hours almost, but there's a couple more questions I wanted to ask you, Nathan. One is that you've mentioned that you're working on a book. So I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. So it is a book that I started writing probably 10 years ago, but I mostly compiled it in my brain. And I've got a Patreon for it. But
nice.
I'm at a place where ever since the pandemic started, sorry about my dog again.
It's okay.
I've kind of been focusing on other stuff, and I'm getting to a place where I'm going to try and dive back into it.
Nice.
And it's basically, it's about Earth living. Kind of the rich middle ground between rewilding and permaculture. It's about becoming useful to yourself, the land, and the culture. And it's not your typical like survival skills book. It'll have stuff like that in it. But it's really heavy on kind of the stuff I focus on in my keeping as well, of making everything holistic I'm really trying to focus on like decolonizing earth skills, because I mean so much of it is taken from cultures that our culture has largely destroyed. And yeah, I'm it's kind of sprawling. I'm trying to kind of narrow it down a little bit more, because I could write it for the rest of my life if I don't like contain it a little bit. But
yeah, of
yeah,
course. Those are pretty huge subjects to try and broach.
yeah, and it's crazy. Like when I got into rewilding, I was like, oh, like, you know, I'm gonna have to learn a ton about plants and animals and how to hunt and gather, and I'm gonna have to learn how to start a fire and build a shelter and all of that. And I was like, oh, that's a huge topic, but like, oh, this is doable. And then I was like, oh, like hunter gatherers spent their whole life learning this stuff, like 24/7, like living
in
it.
immersion.
And they weren't in a culture that tries to break anybody that tries to escape. And they didn't have to think about like, how do these skills relate to what this corporation is spraying here, or how are we going to deal, like if say we do like go back to living as hunter gatherers, what are we going to do with nuclear power plants? Like what are we like it the whole thing, it's already so much to learn. And then you have like all of the stuff of like our culture is completely different. And like, yeah, it's so much to
a lot of compounding factors. Yeah. On the subject of like
encouraged about stuff like bioremediation, where you can use plants and fungi to break down pollution. Stuff like that is encouraging, but there's so much to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, on the subject of like rewilding in particular, I'm curious if you've are you familiar with the work that the guys at Celtic Reptile and Amphibian are doing with like they're actually working on trying to like actually rewild some species native to the UK. I just think that that's really cool to see it like that, like kind of convergence there with like rewilding and herpetoculture. It's kind of neat to see, and not something I thought I would necessarily see in this lifetime, but glad it's happening. Well, I think it's time for the big question. Did you have anything, Phil, before we get to the big question?
Frankly, I've just been kind of sitting back and enjoying listening and learning, because so much of this stuff kind of is way outside my wheelhouse and a little over my head. So I've just been enjoying and kind of trying to absorb and take in what I can. So I'm good. I've been enjoying all of this.
Cool. Can I share one story quick
before no, please. Yeah.
Okay. So when I was doing my sculpture and welding apprenticeship in Nigeria, we went on vacation to this place called Wiki Warm Springs, which it's in a national park, and it's, you know, these little bungalows, and you go down this path to a spring that's got rocks on one side of it, like a big cliff, and then kind of dirt walls that go up, and then they've put in like a cement area to make it kind of like a pool side. But then the far side of it is just wild. And then if you go down farther, you get to like where there's crocodiles and crazy stuff. I never went down there. My sister went down and swam with the crocodiles once. That was real smart. Anyway, I was swimming there, and fortunately there weren't many people around, and I was just floating around swimming, and we had seen an adult Nile monitor
nice
on the path on our way down there. And I'm just floating, and I get maybe 6 feet from the bank, and I look over at the bank, on the wild side of it, and there is a baby Nile monitor drinking from the edge of the spring.
Wow.
And I just like swam the slowest I could possibly swim. And so my face was within a foot of the baby Nile monitor before it noticed me.
Oh, wow.
But even when it noticed me, it just stopped drinking and looked at me, and I just slowly backed away. That was like, that was like one of my most amazing moments.
Oh,
that's so amazing.
Great. What a wonderful story. That's so cool. It's always so nice when we get these sort of candid moments of interaction with a wild reptile. It's pretty beautiful thing.
Yeah, I'm a terrible herper, but I've happened to like be in the right place at the right time when I wasn't trying to herp.
I feel like a lot of herping is mostly that.
Yeah.
That's great, man. That's wonderful stuff.
Cool.
So Roy, do you want me to ask the question or you?
Yeah, you go for it.
All right, Nathan. So I think you may know the question that's coming, but we kind of have of course we have this show tradition, and feel free to take it as broadly or as specifically as you like, but the question, as you know, is why herpetoculture? Why do we do this? What's the idea? What's the whole point?
Yeah, so I've listened to everybody else's answers, and they're mine. I completely agree. The one probably unique idea I've had is that maybe in the future, herpetoculture isn't going to really exist, because maybe society collapses and we don't have the luxury of having heat lamps and UV lamps and whatnot, but maybe we have food sources that we've learned to grow because of herpetoculture, where I think just in and of itself, there's probably not enough motivation for most people to think about raising mealworms or roaches or crickets or whatever to feed humanity. There's definitely some people that are into it just for that sake, but I think a lot of people have really dialed in their ability to productively grow all kinds of insects that would be great food sources in like collapse times. And maybe that's why. Of course, that's just one version. I mean, obviously the answers that everybody else has given are the ones that I would have given if I hadn't already heard what they said.
Well, hey, that's okay. First of all, there's absolutely no problem with giving an answer that's been given before if it aligns with what you're feeling. But I also think that that's a fantastic answer too. Like perhaps herpetoculture will serve a post-collapse purpose. That's it's a little dystopian, but it's a good one. I like it. It's pretty funny. I enjoy that. Well, that's awesome, man. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Answer. And thanks for the time. Where can people find you on the internets, and then specifically, where can people find your Patreon?
So on the internet, I have a YouTube channel that I haven't really uploaded in a long time, but it's got a bunch of videos on plants and some on fungi and other stuff. And that's just Nathan Carlos Rupley on YouTube. I'm on Facebook. I want to leave it, but I can't find anything else that really quite works.
Okay.
And then the Patreon, if you just look up my name and Earth Living, the book should come up.
Okay.
If people do sign up for the Patreon, I want them to know that I don't post very frequently, and sometimes maybe I dive in and we'll do 3 posts in a month. So maybe sign up for like have your limit set. But then I might go 6 months without posting anything. And then the other thing is though that you do get access to a rough draft,
Nice.
like a Google Doc. So you can now I do write some of it off in another Google Doc and then import it in, but you do get to see almost all of what I've written so far. And you get to see maybe like the post, like the section on rewilding or permaculture. Maybe you'll see my ranting and raving about how angry I am about it more than will actually show up in the final version.
Nice.
But yeah, like people should know that that it's a long process. I've got a lot written, but it's a long way to go. I don't want people to sign up and be like, "Oh, why aren't you writing like this month or whatever?" I've got a crazy life, and yeah, I'm. The other thing is, I have found Patreon, for me at least, is not the community I had hoped it would be. Like the whole reason, like, you know, a little bit of money for like it's great, but it doesn't really. That's not really my motivation. I was hoping it would build a community, and I would get feedback because I'm really isolated, and I know a lot, but I can also kind of like focus on this or focus on that. And I was hoping people would be asking me questions. So what I would really like is if people do sign up, that they get involved, ask me questions. I like anything anybody wants to know my opinion of, I'll let them know, and that will help me write the book by being prompted on this and that. So
yeah, for sure.
Like that.
Nice. Awesome, man. That's great. Well, here, let me go ahead and hit the stop button on the recording.